Toki ya, mi ankikan-san, mi wile pana e sono pona pi Toki Pona. Wile la okute pona. Hi, my name is Greg Dan3. I'm going to be giving a short lesson on how to use Toki Pona. In this case, we're going to be talking about the specifics of how you would translate, how you would break down an idea in order to translate it into Toki Pona. And we're going to be starting with a couple of very simple ideas and exploring what different ways you could look at translating those. And we'll be moving on to more complex versions of translation where we would need multiple sentences to express the entire idea. We'll even be giving ourselves a restriction. In this case, no proper nouns, right? No proper nouns. So let's start. And the very first thing we're going to look at is the idea of a conlang. And I'm sure plenty of you are familiar with conlangs, given you're in the Toki Pona community, interested in Toki Pona. The important thing about a conlang, which of course we know is short for constructed language, is that it is specifically a creation, right? And there are many different ways you could come at this in order to translate it into Toki Pona, and we're first going to focus on this idea of it being a creation, right? Now, knowing the list of Toki Pona words, we can say pretty clearly, this is a pali. This is a creation, right? And of course, since we're specifically stating that it is a language, it is also a toki, right? And in context, it would be valid to refer to it both ways, as either just a pali or just a toki. So going from there, we can say the important properties of a constructed language are toki, pali, and that gives us our first option for how we might translate this. We would say that our conlang is a toki pali, but that is not the only way to translate it. There are other properties of a constructed language that might be important to a listener, such that you want to communicate it in that way. Again, Toki Pona doesn't use the same words all the time to refer to the same things. Toki Pona's descriptions of things are fluid, and they're not always referring to the same objects, nor are the same objects always referred to in the same way. So, with that out of the way, let's look at some other properties of a conlang that are important for understanding how you would describe it in Toki Pona. Well, most conlangs, which is to say, pretty much every conlang but Esperanto, are notable for having very few speakers. So, there are natural languages, natlangs, that have fewer speakers than Toki Pona, and certainly some that have fewer than Esperanto. But we can still note that to a common listener, most languages do have many millions of speakers, right? And so it may be notable to such a person that a conlang has very few speakers. So we could say, Toki ni li yo e yan pi mute ala, as in, this language has few people. And that distinction is important because, again, the properties of a conlang aren't limited to just the fact that it is constructed or that it's a language. It's also important that the number of speakers of this language, that could matter to a listener, right? And here's something else. Now, I wouldn't necessarily describe a conlang this way, but it is true that plenty of people looking at a conlang would describe it as a fake language. And in this sense, you could describe it as a toki, excuse my handwriting, a toki pi lon ala. A toki pi lon ala. As in, a false language, a language that does not exist, in a sense. And again, I don't believe this is a fully fair characterization of Toki Pona or conlangs in general, but it may be something which is relevant to your listener. Because when speaking Toki Pona, the important thing is not just how you think and feel about this object, but also considering how your listener thinks and feels about the object, right? And if your listener feels differently from you, it may be important, advantageous to communication, in order to describe something in a way they would understand. So in this case, if you have somebody, now I guess we are presenting kind of a funny concept here where we're describing conlangs as a Toki Pilon ala, presumably in Toki Pona to somebody who speaks enough Toki Pona to understand you. And so, yeah, you're probably not going to encounter such a case in Toki Pona specifically. But nonetheless, it is entirely possible in principle to encounter a case where you might want to describe Toki Pona as a Toki Pilon ala, and conlangs in general as a Toki Pilon ala, right? And let's at least look at one more property here. Excuse me. So, conlangs are also notable because, unlike a majority of natural languages, they don't come from a specific location other than, you might say, the creation of the creator, or the location of the creator, right? But it would be a little disingenuous to say, oh, Toki Pona is from Toronto, where Jan Sonja lives. That would be a little odd, right? Instead, you could call this still a Toki, of course, Ma ala. In the sense that Toki Pona doesn't really have a place, a location to call its own. And you wouldn't expect that of pretty much any conlang, right? So that's another possibility as far as like properties of a conlang that are important for translation. Now, we're going to move on to another example that is a common way to get across the idea of a calque and what to avoid when trying to translate into Toki Pona, right? We're going to look at this phrase to give up, or the idea of giving up, right? Now, of course, we can start here by looking at each of these words. Okay, we have give, we have up, and we can look those up in a Toki Pona dictionary and go, oh, give, that means pana. Okay, there we go. And then up, that's, sewi, right? Sewi. And immediately, we have run into one of the most common traps for new speakers of Toki Pona. This is a calque. We have translated the original phrase, give up, too literally. And in so doing, we have created a phrase that doesn't make any sense in the target language. In this case, Toki Pona. Now, it's worth mentioning that calques are common in pretty much every Nat language. It's very, very common when two cultures meet to end up with translations that don't really track in the language that they end up in, right? And this is an example of that in Toki Pona, and we're going to work around this problem by thinking about what it means to give up or to be giving up, right? We're going to look at this and correct this. So let's think deeply about what it really means to give up, right? You could be giving up in a competition, in which case you are accepting defeat. You have lost the competition, right? You could also be giving up in the context of, say, a trip. You're on a hike, right? And you say, I can't go any further. I am going to stop here, right? So let's put together some context for the idea of being on a hike. Let's start there. So let's say you and a friend are on a hike, and your friend behind you is struggling to keep up. Well, if your friend is struggling to keep up, you might want to say, hey, let's stop for a moment. Let's give up for a little bit. We can turn back. We can go back to the car, and we can head back home, right? Maybe the hike is too much for your friend. Maybe it's just not a good day for it. Maybe it's way too hot outside. But under these circumstances, we know that our friend is struggling to continue the hike. And so I would say to them, oh, Owen, something like, hey, let's stop. Let's stop and rest for a moment. Let's stand here. Let's wait. Catch our breath. Maybe we'll keep going. Maybe we won't. So this isn't, in principle, strictly to give up in the sense that we're leaving the possibility open to continue. But nonetheless, this is one way you might say, hey, let's stop for a moment. Let's catch our breath. We're going to continue. Maybe we'll turn back. We're not giving up, but we are in the vein of it, right? We're pausing here. And it is totally reasonable to translate this idea of giving up as o awen, which could be something as simple as stop and rest, or it could be stop, don't go any further, right? It's also worth mentioning here that the context does matter a good bit. Excuse me. Because, of course, o awen in this context could mean o awen tawa, as in to continue moving, or it could be o awen as in o tawa ala, stop moving, right? We could really mean either one, and the context is what disambiguates it. So if I were to speak to my friend who's behind me and they're having trouble keeping up, but they're still excited, absolutely ecstatic for the hike, enjoying the trip, I would probably say, "O awen," as in, "Hey, let's keep going." And if it is the case that my friend is struggling, breathing heavily, and they have been, I don't know, maybe complaining along the trip, they're struggling to keep up, I would say, "O awen," as in, "Hey, let's stop. We're done here." That's just a little bit of disambiguation as far as context. If you ever wanted to be more specific, of course, you would go back to the examples I gave before, where I might say "o awen tawa," as in to keep going, or "o tawa ala," as in to stop moving, right? Either way, we have this idea of o awen, which is one way we could properly describe give up. And just to be clear here, we're going to scratch out panasewi. We don't need that laying around. All right, then there's one more way that's at least simple that we can translate this idea of giving up. Next, we have o anpa. So, if you've read over a Toki Pona dictionary or otherwise are familiar with the language, you're probably aware that anpa is used relatively frequently to refer to the idea of defeat, as in you have lost a competition or you've lost a battle, something has happened, you are defeated. In this case, we're providing it as a command, right? That detail is important because we are instructing somebody, which is part of the intent of to give up. It is an instruction. We're saying, hey, you're done. Game over, right? But it is still an instruction. And so here we provide a command, and then we say o anpa, which again here means to accept defeat. Of course, it could also mean something like go down, as in literally to move downward, or maybe get low to the ground, get down. But of course, contextually, we're in the middle of a competition. If somebody says o anpa, they really do mean give up, accept defeat, right? And so that's a couple of ways you could more properly translate this idea of giving up. All right, so let's continue. I have one example that was asked of me only a couple of days ago. It's asking, how do you translate the idea of a crime into Toki Pona? And that's actually very, very interesting because translating the idea of a crime into Toki Pona, well, it's very, very relative, right? So let's start here with crime, right? What are the important properties of the idea of a crime? Well, first, I would say that a lot of crime is ike tawa yan. And this is pretty easy to convince yourself of. Most of the time, when there is a crime, there is somebody who has lost something as a result of that crime. Now, it could be that they've been injured. It could be that something has been taken from them. I don't really know. And that's not really relevant to this example as far as like we're trying to examine the idea of crime itself. But it is a possibility, a strong possibility, that something bad has happened to a person, right? And then there's another case. Ike tawa lawa, right? And this is, again, fairly easy to convince yourself of. Most of the time, when you have something that is a crime, it is defined in the context of some controlling entity, in this case, a government organization that says, hey, these things are not allowed. You can't do these. Usually, ideally, of course, to the effort of defending the citizens, defending the people who that organization is responsible for, right? And so, yeah, here we have at least two significant properties of a crime. We can say it is bad to a person and it is bad to lawa. All right, so if that makes sense, if that's enough to convince yourself, we can continue from there. We can actually start describing crimes in Toki Pona with just this amount of information. So I think the simplest way would be to take these phrases we've already broken down and to use them as context for a sentence in which we say some action occurs. In this case, we can say Ike tawa lawa la, right? Starting our context phrase. Yan li kama yo e io, io tan yan ante. Ike tawalawala, as in the context of something being bad to a controlling organization, to the controller, to the government. La, yan le kamayo e io tan yan ante. A person received a thing from another person. Now, it is worth pausing for a moment to think about kamayo. Here, of course, we recognize that kama is to arrive or to invite, and yo is to have. So together, it really means more like to become having, to receive something. But in this case, we are providing context in which we know this is bad in some way. In fact, it would also be pretty similar to just say Ike la, skipping the tawalawa part entirely. And so we could say Ike la, yan li kamayo e io tan yan ante. And that distinction lets us realize kamayo here is to steal, to take without the willingness of another person, right? And of course, we can spend more time to express this if we didn't have this context, or if we simply wanted to be more specific, right? So we can also say yan ante li wile ala, right? So now we've provided more context about the second person, the yan ante, who was involved in this action. Here we're saying more clearly, the other person didn't want this. And so here we have a not, of course, perfectly precise, but sufficient explanation of a crime occurring in Toki Pona. We say, Ike tawalawala, yan li kamayo e io tan yan ante. Yan ante li wile ala e ni. Altogether, we're saying, in the context of something being bad, and in this case, specifically bad to our government, la, a person received an item, received a thing from another person, and that other person did not want it. As in, did not want that to occur. And so, if that idea makes sense, you might also wonder, well, what about the word lanpan, one of the nimiku suli? And yeah, I think lanpan would be appropriate here. It would be very much valid to use lanpan right here in place of kamayo. So if you're familiar with the nimiku suli, lanpan is to take, to receive, to steal, and it is not necessarily crime-related, although it is commonly defined as to steal, right? And so yeah, it would be, in most cases, valid to put lanpan here in the middle, and then, if you've done so, it's not strictly necessary to provide the context that it's bad to the government, or that the other person didn't want it, right? Since lanpan does have that common connotation that it was bad. Now, it's still worth mentioning, and it's very important to realize, lanpan, despite being defined as to steal, doesn't always imply ike, right? You can have pona kinds of lanpan. We're not going to explore that idea here, but it is worth being aware of lanpan's connotations, and it doesn't necessarily imply ike. It can, and certainly in this context, it would, right? Especially with all this supportive context, like being bad to the government, being unwanted by the other person, but it's not going to communicate everything we need to. So if that all tracks, the next thing we have is a long-form description of what it means to play Mario. What we're going to do here is try to describe the idea of playing specifically Mario in Toki Pona. And, of course, you might think to yourself, oh, well, that's easy. Mi musi Mario. Or if you want to be more precise, mi musi e musi Mario, right? You use a proper noun. You could say, mi musi, capital M, ma, we, yo. And yeah, that would certainly get the idea across, so long as the other person that you were speaking to knew Mario, right? As long as they were familiar with the series of games about Mario. Well, that's fine, but here's the thing. This is complete, but what if we're talking to somebody who doesn't know anything about Mario? We can't just say, hey, this is Mario. And they go, oh, okay, I understand. We need to describe to them in full what it means to play Mario. And we have to start all the way at the beginning, as in, maybe they don't even know that this is played on a video game console. Maybe they don't know about the whole history of platformers, of video games, right? Now, these are not necessarily true. In fact, I would take a guess and say, especially among the Toki Pona community, pretty much everybody is going to be familiar with Mario, right? That said, if we were to imagine this, we can imagine one more restriction that would make it reasonable to have a conversation about Mario with a person in Toki Pona, but not use the name Mario. So there's this common nasin. I wouldn't say common necessarily, but there is this nasin that is at least popular among a fair number of people. I would say a couple of dozen that I am aware of, who reject the idea of using proper nouns pretty much all of the time in Toki Pona. And this nasin is very, very interesting because it means that all names are purely descriptive. You always have to describe the thing you are talking about. And so that is what we are going to do. No more Mario. We are going to say mi musi. And then yan ante li toki e ni. Sina musi eseme. Well, let's start. So the first thing that's important about breaking down the idea of a video game, specifically, of course, in this case, we know it's Mario, but what's important about breaking down a video game is that it is on an hilo, right? There is some kind of hilo that is involved in playing the game. And that detail is where we will begin with breaking down this idea of playing Mario. Mi musi, kepeken hilo musi. And this gives us a bit of context about where this is going to start, right? We're saying, I am doing something entertaining, and it is using an entertaining tool, right? You could take a moment to describe the hilo. So, hilo la, sinalukin e iomute e yan musi e montuta. So, in the context that we've provided, we're doing something entertaining, and it is using an entertaining tool. And then we're describing what happens in the context of that entertaining tool. So, of course, since we're in this one conversation, we can say pretty confidently that this hilo is the same one from this previous sentence. That detail is important and will keep coming back. It will be a part of the cornerstone of how you describe ideas, how you break things down in Toki Pona, right? This idea that you can provide not just individual words as context, but actually whole ideas that you've previously introduced as context. This is how you get more specific concepts into Toki Pona. And so from here, as we've described, we have fun using a fun tool. And in the context of that tool, which we could say implicitly is the hilo musi, of course, you can look at many things, a fun person, or maybe fun people, and monsters. You could probably be more clear about monstata here, since this can be scary or fearful, but we do mean it to be monster. So you could say, Jan Montuta, as a contrast to Jan Musi, right? But this here gives us several more things to provide context about. Here, we're now talking about the things in the game, but we've yet to describe all the things you can do with each of those objects in the game. So we're going to break down each and every one of these. And again, we're still doing this in the context of Mario. So we have many things. We have our fun person. We have our monsters, our Jan Montuta. So I'm going to clear this. And we will start from there. So we have Io Mute. Well, what things are there in Mario that we need to describe to our listener? Maybe we care about Leko, bricks, squares that are popular throughout the game. Maybe we care about Ma. Maybe we care about the levels of the game. Maybe we care about Kasi, the funny kind of plants that appear in the game. Especially in Mario, you have highly stylized trees and mushrooms that you could want to talk about. And of course, we have separately, which we're not going to talk about yet, but I'm going to leave myself a little reminder up here. We have Jan Musi, Jan Montuta. Right? But we're going to explore this idea a little more. So in the case of Leko, well, we're here going to describe the fact that the world is made up of bricks for the most part, as it is in several Mario games. So we could say, Ma li Leko lon Musi. Ma li Leko lon Musi. Now, this is a relatively simple idea here. All we're saying is the ground is square, brick-like, in the context of this entertainment. And of course, again, we're still in the same conversation, so it makes perfect sense to simply describe it as a musi without being more specific to, oh, this is the whole video game. We're already doing that. We're in the process of that. So we have Ma li Leko lon Musi, and you can Sina ken pakala e Leko kepeken lawa. And you can be more specific, kepeken lawa Sina. So we've introduced that there are bricks in the game world. In fact, the ground here is primarily made of bricks. And often, you have the ability to destroy those bricks, Sinaken pakala e Leko, using your head, Kepeken lawasina. This is, again, more context to how Mario works. And so if you have been following along up to this point, we really are just breaking down all the different things you can do in Mario, all the different things that exist in Mario, because we can't describe Mario by just his name. So continuing, then you have Ma. Ma being, say, the levels of the game. And of course, we know, as the speaker here, that Mario has a huge amount of variety in its game worlds. So I'm not going to go into specific detail about all the different ways you can describe the land, but I will at least throw out a couple of examples. There are, for example, the vast plains that are usually your opening levels of the game, so you can describe those. And you might say, Sinalon ma pikasilili, as in you are in a place of little plants. Monzutalilon, there are monsters here. Lonpini ma la, Lensuli ma lilon. In this case, at the end of the world, we're saying there is a cloth, a big cloth of the place, which is kind of a way that you can get at the idea of there being a flag there, right? And that is a very common feature in your Mario games. You can also describe, say, the castles in Mario. And in the case of the castles, you might say, Tomo Suliwawa Lilon, as in, a big, powerful building is here. Sinalon Tomola, as in, you are in the house, la. Sinalukin e leko walopimea, you are looking at bricks that are black and white, which is to say, actually, it would be better to express that as leko pi walopimea, in which case you would have white modified by black, giving you gray. So you are in a building, and you can see gray bricks. Kinla telo seli lilon. A common feature in Mario game castles is lava. Telo seli. Very, very hot liquid, right? And you can go on like that. There's all sorts of different things about the castle you could describe. There's also the case of ghost houses. Ghost houses, again, another common feature of levels in Mario games, would be something like Tomo Piyan Moli Mute Mute, right? A place of many dead people. I suppose they're not necessarily people. The Mario games, I guess, don't really make it clear. I don't know. But certainly there are ghosts there, and as a convenience, we could call them Yan Moli, or maybe we could just call them Moli, or Iyo Moli, right? But certainly there are lots of Moli, Lontomo, and Moli, Iyo Moli, Liwile Moli Esina, Liwile Anpa Esina. They want to kill you. They want to defeat you. Excuse me. It's also kind of interesting to throw in a little interjection here. Moli is one of the words in Toki Pona where it has multiple possible meanings as far as how it applies transitively and how it applies intransitively. So in this case, Moli, of course, refers to ghosts. Moli there meaning dead. But the ghosts are also killers. And that's also another meaning of Moli. Ona li Moli, ona li wile Moli esina. They are dead and they want to kill you, right? So quite humorously, I think, they are Moli in both senses of the word at the same time. They are dead and killers. Let's see. We can also back up and describe the unique plants present in Mario, right? So, of course, we have our funny-looking trees, which I'll try to give you a little rendition of. You have the funny bell-shaped trees that are present in Super Mario 3D World. You have the odd hill trees with eyes on them that are present in Super Mario World. And you have these different Sike trees that are present. I really should draw that better. Well, no worries. You have these Sike trees that appear in a couple of other games as well. And of course, a lot of the plants in Super Mario World and a lot of the objects too have eyes. You have your Forest of Illusion type trees. And so that detail might be important to you. It might be important to your listener as well. Kasi lilon musi la, as in the plants in the game, or if the plants are in the game is kind of the expression that we'd say in English to translate that idea. But kasi lilon musi la, onali yo e lukin. The plants that are in the game have eyes. Onali musi tawalukin kin, as in they are funny visually, right? And they are. A lot of the objects presented in the Mario world are quite funny looking, right? Entertaining to look at. They're in a comical style. Well, not comical. I think I'm looking for a cartoonish style, and they're in a cartoonish style. But nonetheless, I would say they are musi tawalukin. Again, we're not going to look at this exhaustively, but understand there are many, many, many little pieces that you can pull together to describe the world of Mario in full in Toki Pona. And we're going to step back here to look at Yan Musi. So let me clear this. We have Yan Musi. There we go. Yan Musi, which is, of course, our titular character Mario. We've already resolved to not use the name of the character. And maybe that doesn't mean something, that doesn't mean anything to our listener anyway. So what properties of Mario are important? Well, ona li yo e len lawa loye. I think this is one of Mario's most defining traits. He has a red hat on his head. In this case, of course, we can be more literal about this. Ona li yo e len lawa loye is they have a red headcloth, which we would understand pretty cleanly to mean hat, of course, a red hat. Continuing from there, we can tack onto this sentence. Actually, let's do it right here. Li yo e. Actually, we don't even have to say li yo, excuse me. Ona li yo e len lawa loye. E len cielo. And the len cielo is lasso. Right? Mario, of course, has his blue overalls. And then we have one more thing important about his outfit. He also has len noka pimea. He also has dark brown shoes, which of course we're not going to need to be specific about. But in this case, len noka pimea, well, contextually in this sentence, of course, we are describing the fact that our character has cloth on his head, cloth on his body, and cloth on his legs, feet. Well, I think it is clear enough here to say if cielo is covered, this is probably noka as in feet. So we have cloth that is dark over his feet as in shoes, right? So in full, we've kind of described what our character looks like. And I guess I should step back a moment because I did skip one little detail that's kind of connective here, which would describe the context of this character, right? Because we know that there are other actors present in this game, and our listener might not know that. And so they may not know exactly which one we're talking about. In this case, we know that our Yan Musi is the player character, who we are actually playing as. And so we can, and let me clear this really quick. There we go. Continuing with Sina Musi la Sina lawa e Yan Musi. Now, like I said before, I kind of glossed over this. I wasn't thinking about it. But this detail is important and tells our listener a lot, right? And so you can imagine this being like one step before we began describing the clothes on Yan Musi. And so, Sina Musi la, Sina lawa e Yan Musi. As in, if you play, you control a fun person. An entertaining person. Something like that. And so, altogether, we have this construction that tells our listener about, of course, from the previous set of description, we tell our listener what we're going to look like when we're playing the game, what our Yan Musi looks like. And so you can imagine Yan Musi to be like context for the entire description of what he's wearing. Yan Musi la, ona de yo e len lawa loye, e len cielo lasso, e len noka pimea. Our fun person has a red hat, blue clothes on his body, blue cloth on his body, and dark colored shoes. And there's, of course, one more really, really important property of this player character, which is the fact that you control them. Well, now we can step back and ask, what ways we can ask what ways are there to control this character, right? So continuing, Sina, let's say lawa, la, Sina lawa, as in you control, or you are in control, you are the government, haha. Yan, excuse me. You can say Yan Musi Li Tawa. Right? So the first thing, of course, is that our character moves, which, if you're familiar with any sort of game, that seems pretty obvious, right? Li Tawa Sewi, as in to move up. And then we can be more specific about Tawa Sewi. And that can actually be a bridge into our last part. So, Tawa Sewi la Sina ken anpa e monsuta. Tawa sewi la Sina ken anpa e monsuta. As in, if you are moving up, of course, we understand this to mean jumping. La Sina ken anpa e monsuta. You can defeat monsters. And this detail is, of course, really, really important to how Mario works, right? This is like one of the core gameplay mechanics of Mario, his ability to jump and use that to defeat monsters. And so, as I noted, this gives us a bridge into the last part of how we would describe Mario to a listener, right? Now, let's take a moment to pause and think again about the fact that we're not simply here to describe Mario, but to break down all the little pieces that are involved in a game of Mario. And in so doing, essentially teach our listener about what Mario is. Communicate effectively in Toki Pona. And of course, in order to do so, you're always thinking about what are the core components of this idea and how can I best express them to a listener? Right. There's also another little detail here which I'll throw in, which we already talked about a bit earlier, and you could use this moment to connect back. So we talked about earlier how the world is primarily made of bricks, and you can destroy those using your head. Ma li leko mute la sina ken pakala e leko kepaken lawasina. The world is made up of many bricks, and you can destroy the bricks using your head. Again, we talked about this before. You can connect back to this idea to expand on Tawa Sewi and describe the fact that you use the jumping ability, the Tawa Sewi, in order to destroy the bricks with your head. This bit of connective information could give your listener a lot more context about the world, a lot more connective tissue to get that idea into their head. I guess another thing I should pause on before continuing. It's very, very common to have to describe a lot in order to get an idea across in Toki Pona. Generally, I would say that the less context your listener has for whatever you're talking about, the more you're going to have to describe in order to get the idea across. And this is not an issue that is limited to Toki Pona. I would say this is true in essentially any language, right? If you don't already have one core word dedicated to the concept and you don't both have that word in common, as in you don't both know it or are not both looking at it, then yeah, you're going to spend some time to fully describe the thing. You're going to spend a lot of time to fully describe the thing. I'm not quite sure how long we've been here for, but certainly we've been describing Mario for a hot minute. And we're not quite done. So continuing from there, let's clear this. There we go. We can then describe monster. Now, I'm only going to make one specific monster example, at least as far as what I'll be writing down. But there are a lot of different iconic creatures in Mario to describe that may be important to your listener, right? But in this case, we're going to say, of course, one little detail we've expressed before, Musila, Montuta, Li, Lon. And let's pick one of them. In this case, Montuta, Li, Akesi, Tawa, Lukin. Now, this detail has probably already told you exactly which creature I'm going to be talking about. Of course, we're talking about generic Mario enemies, so plenty of you will have thought of Bowser, and yes, that's a great example as well. But in this case, we're going to be talking about one of the first creatures you encounter in a Mario game, the Koopa. Which, yes, you will have encountered a Koopa pretty quickly in Mario, and Montuta, referring more generically to the Koopa, Montuta li Akesi Tawalukin. Visually, as in to your eyes, it looks like a reptile. And you can continue. Li Lon Tomo Cielo. Lilon Tomo Cielo, as in, is in a body home, right? And this is something which gives you some real world context for what things exist in the game, right? Of course, a lot of people hearing this statement, Montuta li Akesi Tawalukin, Lilon Tomo Cielo, altogether would think, oh, wait a minute, that's a turtle. That's a turtle, right? There are a fair number of Akesi that live in Tomo, that is their body, right? That is Cielo. But I would say for a majority of listeners, this bit of context would tell you that the creature we're talking about is a turtle, right? And what else can you do with the Koopa? Well, one of the most interesting and interactive things about the early Mario games was the ability to defeat Koopas and then use their shells as weapons. So how will we best describe that? Well, we described before that it's possible to defeat your opponents by jumping on them, sina tawa sewila, sina ken anpa e montuta. And that detail can come back here to describe how we can obtain the Tomo, how we can describe further what happens in this context, right? So, sina anpa e monsuta ni la. If you defeat this monster, la, sina kama yo e tomo. If you defeat this monster, sina kama yo e tomo, as in you receive the room, the tomo cielo, of course, connecting back to this previous sentence. And you can continue from there. Kepaken tomo la. Kepaken tomo la. Sina ken anpa e monsuta ante. Sina ken anpa e monsuta ante. Now, I'm not going to go too much further, at least as far as writing this, but of course, we can expand upon this detail even further as well. So here we're saying, you defeat a monster. Going back, that monster is Akazitawa looking and has a tomo. And then, once you defeat the monster, you receive the tomo. And then we can say, using the tomo, kepaken tomo la, sinaken anpa e monster ante, as in you can defeat different monsters, right? Altogether, we've described what it means to interact with one of the enemies in the game. And I said we can expand on this, so we'll do that a little bit at least. Of course, here we're saying using the tomo, but we're not actually expressing what it means to use the tomo, right? And of course, we know, as people who have definitely played Mario before, sinatawa e tomo la, tawa, tomotawa liken anpa e monster. As in, if you move the tomo, la, tomotawa, referring back to the tomo that we've just moved, tomotawa liken anpa e monster. As in, the moving tomo can defeat the monsters, right? And this is, I think, one of the most fun things about Toki Pona. You're always kind of playing a game, as it were, where you need to strike a balance between the amount of context you're going to provide and the amount of description that is necessary to get the idea across, right? And I think every single one of these ideas that is expressed on the board right now, and every single idea that I've expressed thus far in describing the game of Mario, every single one of them can be expanded upon further. We can provide paragraphs upon paragraphs of description of what it means to play a Mario game, all without ever saying the main character's name. And yeah, it is totally possible to do that. You probably, again, won't encounter a specific case where it's necessary. But this idea that you can always break down these concepts into further and further details is critical to your understanding of the relationship between ideas and words in Toki Pona. And I really hope this has been helpful to you. I really hope that all of this together gives you a strong idea of what it means to translate something into Toki Pona, to really get at an idea, right? I hope you explore this idea further. Think of one of your favorite games and try it out. Try describing that game only in Toki Pona, imagining a person who has never played it before, right? Because that's often what you're doing. Not necessarily strictly, oh, this person has never heard of this thing before. But certainly, you have these little building blocks that need to come together to describe the thing you're talking about, to describe to somebody else what you mean. And these little building blocks work together, I think, in a kind of multiplicative way. Because we started saying mimusi, right? And then we continued mimusi, kepaken ilomusi. And that's already a lot of context to somebody who lives in the modern world, to somebody who has experienced a video game before, even if not Mario, or if they simply don't quite know yet what we're talking about. Certainly, the further context we stack on, the more likely it is that it'll connect to an idea in their mind that is what we're talking about, right? That you've kind of dug your way into that context that they understand, that mutual understanding of the world, found it, now you're both on the same page. Honestly, it is the most fun. I hope you learned something today. Thank you so much for coming.